It's a delight to have a dear friend, Don Morrison, this morning or this evening with us. He's joining us from Canada. And Don is a wonderful example of the conversation that we are going to have today. Somebody who's accomplished in the conventional world by virtue of being the CEO of BAI Communications in Canada, previously Chief Operating Officer for BlackBerry Research in Motion, and also serving as the chairperson for the Thomas Merton Center in Canada, and really knowledgeable through his own interest, both about Thomas Merton, but also Christianity. And it's an ongoing exploration that both of us have been talking about in many different ways. And today's topic is oscillations between worlds, which is to explore, are there really multiple worlds and the multiple roles that we live on a day-to-day basis, and what should the outcome be? So Don, I'll switch to you for the opening.
Thank you very much, Tenzin. So I'll also say to everybody, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I thank Tenzin, first of all, for the opportunity to be with everybody today, to have this opportunity to talk. The cadence at which I'm going to go might be a little bit slower than what I would normally talk, simply because we are translating today's conversation into other languages, and want to be sure that the ideas are properly conveyed. First of all, I just want to make a mention of my dear friend Tenzin and the tremendous work that he's doing. I met Tenzin now more than 10 years ago, and I was deeply interested in this interior journey and what people were doing in the world in order to help encourage a greater degree of compassion and understanding. And frankly, it was really Tenzin more than anybody else that seemed to look at this journey from a much more practical perspective. And rather than being caught up, not just in the areas of research, but was actually doing something to provide assistance to people to lead transformative lives. And he's certainly doing that through the Dalai Lama Center at MIT and the work that he's doing in various countries around the world. Tenzin, if you don't mind, I'll just mention that he did most recently write a book, Running Toward Mystery. And I would certainly, for anybody interested in understanding this conversation that we're having today around the spiritual journey, that you might be interested in reading that. I have said on the book insert in one spot that I think that Tenzin is almost like the Thomas Merton of today. And so I'm, perhaps because of my business background, I'm particularly interested in what people are doing in the marketplace to do things that are practical and transformative and helpful for others. And I think Tenzin, to me, is a leader in that capacity. So I'm very grateful. Let me tell you, the idea here is that I'm going to say some things, and then Tenzin and I are going to have a bit of dialogue, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. But my whole task here is to hopefully say some things which are helpful. All right, so I've obviously, we're talking about a topic which in some ways has elements that are almost indescribable. Certainly the effects of the spiritual journey and trying to understand cause and effect in the spiritual journey, they're essentially indescribable, notwithstanding that there are certain things that I think a person can do. But if I have done anything in the time that we have together, I will have perhaps offered some practical advice that you can make use of in your own life. Here's some of the questions that I'm trying to answer. First of all, how is this spiritual journey distinct from other pursuits that we encounter in our lives, right? And in effect, what I'm going to do, you can almost take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle of it, and then say on the left side, we're going to look at what I'll call the created self, and then on the right side, the transcended self. And so I want to perhaps create this sort of description and framework of two different aspects of what it means to be fully human, right? And then I would like to talk a bit about what actually happens when a person actually commits themselves to a spiritual journey. What are some of the things that actually happen to a person? And then to this topic that Tenzin's brought up around oscillation, which is, what kind of problems can arise? Now, here's an example of a problem. I can actually remember back in 1980, my undergraduate degree was focused on Taoist and Zen philosophy. And I was also studying St. John of the Cross, who's a Christian mystic from Spain. And I had all these notions of non-attachment and non-being and inaction, non-action, those sorts of things, and trying to reconcile those concepts and the practices in my life with actually being out there in the marketplace and having a job and trying to build a career and to be a success. And in my own immaturity, I saw this as having to make a choice. And in some ways I felt conflicted. And at worst, I even felt almost hypocritical that if I was subscribing to what I was reading and learning about the spiritual journey, why was it that I was still very much engaged in things that had to do with personal gain and trying to build an identity, et cetera, right? So I want to talk a little bit about those problems that can arise. And then if Tenzin and I are doing our job today, the idea would be that we can offer some thoughts around what a person can do with respect to this. How does one live inside what appears to be a contradiction? And not to give it away, but the truth is there is actually no contradiction whatsoever. So I am not in any way trying to suggest or proselytize any kind of philosophy or religion in what I'm talking about. But in order to have the conversation, I have to use certain language, right? So what I'm trying to juxtapose is the human dimension and the divine dimension that make up what it means to be fully human. And I think for all of us, if you just reflect on your life, your whole life you spend with a certain degree of restlessness, which is what drives your own personal growth. And I think that, if you study Buddhist philosophy, for example, there's an element in it that speaks of we are not born with a clean slate, that indeed we bring with us the experiences of prior lifetimes. It might interest you to know that even in the Western / Christian tradition, if you study the spirituality of the soul, there is the belief that we bring with us all the experiences of our ancestors all the way back to the Big Bang. And so why do I point this out? I point this out because all of us enter our lives at the very beginning with a certain set of attributes. We all are unique individuals. We all come into this world with certain propensities and history and latent skills. So that is the aspect of us which we then seek to cultivate. This is the human aspect of our lives. And each of us in our own way is different, right? That's the beauty of being human. You know, some are great athletes, some are great musicians, some are great business people. You know, there's a gentleman by the name of Graham at Harvard that wrote that there are, I think, 8 different ways a person can be a genius, right? And so the truth is that all of us have different aspects. Well, we have strengths, we also have some degree of asymmetry with areas in which we don't particularly have strengths. But there's another aspect to our lives, which is the divine aspect. And this is the aspect in which we are all the same, right? And if the human aspect is the created self, the divine aspect has to do with, these are words, but this is also experiential. If a person commits themselves to a spiritual life, that the divine self has to do with pure awareness and the cultivation of an experiential understanding of this other dimension of ourselves. So there is a restlessness that causes us to express ourselves in being fully human. There's also a question that we carry with us in our lives around what else is there over and above our career, over and above what we have built in our relationships with our family, over and above what we have done with our identity. And that aspect is the divine self. So if one embarks on a spiritual journey, how is the spiritual journey different from the other aspect of our lives, right? And so let's say that other aspect is the first journey, which is the development of the created self, the development of those latent skills and experiences that make us unique, that require of us to express our lives in all the talents that we have. How is the second journey different from the first journey? So what I'm trying to set up is this seeming dichotomy between the first journey of the human self and the second journey of the divine self, right? And there's a gentleman that wrote an article on if you wanted, before you can really make progress on the spiritual journey, you really have to make progress on the first journey of being fully human. And what he meant by that was, the article title was "Being Somebody Before You Can Be Nobody," which I thought was very good. And I've actually heard His Holiness say that that you really can't really make progress, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I should say. A person can't make progress on the spiritual journey unless they fully embrace the human journey and see it in that context. So the oscillation occurs between this first journey and the second journey, and I'm being repetitious intentionally. The first journey is really all about building things, gaining things, developing your personality, developing your skill set, developing your talents. As a youth, going to school, then finding your vocation, you know, building your adult relationships, perhaps finding a partner. And that's all about building an identity, right? The spiritual journey is the exact opposite. The spiritual journey doesn't have to do with acquiring things. And in fact, what we're trying to do is we're trying to lose things. We're trying to lose the toxic emotions that, for example, like fear and self-doubt and etc., pride and ego and that sort of thing. The second journey, the spiritual journey, seeks to transcend the self. By transcend, the word transcend means to go beyond the self, right? And if you study the spiritual journey, spiritual masters like Tenzin will tell you that this is not a journey where you're trying to accumulate things. And in fact, what it is to go beyond the identity of the self, to actually see that the divine nature that you have is the same divine nature that everybody has. And that you take practices that create a certain degree of emptying of the self in order to find who you truly are in your divine nature. So the first journey is about building an identity. The second journey is about losing the very identity that you have created. I've always said that if a person pursues the spiritual journey, that they can't find salvation through the intellect, right? Now, I'm saying that conversationally, but if the first journey is development of your mental acuity and your skills and your experience, the second journey is not a journey of the mind, it's a journey of the heart. It's a journey of unlearning, right? And if you studied, I was going to spend some time talking about Maslow, but if those of you that are interested in the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you would see that the basic foundation of human life, we need to pursue things in order for us to survive, right? And then once we have found a way for us to breathe, to get food, right, to find shelter, the next step is to do things to find safety for ourselves, to build relationships and belonging and cultivate love and self-esteem, and ultimately to self-actualize. The spiritual journey goes one step further, and it's not about the accumulation of things, it's the exercise of self-transformation and self-transcendence, right? I call it the divine paradox, because in order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. And in the emptiness of the spiritual journey, you know, nature does not like a void. What you discover is that you go beyond yourself, and the divine paradox is ultimately, it has to do with the energy of love and the manifestation of your experiences in service to others, right? So, I'm not going to dwell on this very long, but what are some of the basic elements of a spiritual journey? The first is quiet the mind. Tenzin very kindly created a program called Contemplative Life and Living, which is now being taught at North Carolina University, along with a friend of his from Harvard Divinity School. And it combines both Buddhist and Christian meditative practices, and examines the benefits of really essentially quieting the mind. And the difficulty for those of us who tend to want to control everything is that we have to learn a discipline in which we release control and we don't worry about cause and effect. So the first aspect of the spiritual journey in which you take yourself seriously is that you commit yourself to a discipline of meditation. The second, which I think is perhaps one of the most important aspects, and I'm just touching on these quickly, is that you see that you are not your thoughts, that you become your own observer. I think one of the great difficulties that we have when we're lying in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and we're worrying about members of our family, or we're worried about our jobs, or we're worried about money, we fall victim to our thoughts, and we fall victim to our fears, and these emotional and thought patterns repeat themselves as cycles. And one of the great benefits of the spiritual journey is to find a way to release ourselves from the tyranny of these thoughts And we do so simply by beginning to see that we ourselves in our state of pure awareness are not really our thoughts at all. That indeed we are the observer of our thoughts. And in fact, we are actually above being the observer, but I won't get into that. But it is this, I think we make tremendous progress when we can begin this understanding to see the created dimension of our personality, and to see that there is an aspect of ourselves that transcends our thoughts, transcends our own image of ourselves. And we begin to see the illusion of that transcendent self. The third aspect is to begin to reflect on these toxic emotions that prevent us from being fully human. And I wouldn't be on a call with Tenzin if I didn't also bring up the importance of, on a spiritual journey, that a person does some kind of ethics evaluation of their own life, right? At the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values, we encourage business students to reflect on the values that guide their life. And this in and of itself is extraordinarily important on the spiritual journey. Each of us must come to a higher level of awareness around the values that guide our life. I'm not suggesting for you that my formula should be your formula, but in 1988 at the Business School of Darden at the University of Virginia, I had the benefit of spending some time with a professor who taught a program around the 4 non-negotiables. I think these 4 non-negotiable principles are like the precepts in Buddhism and perhaps the 10 Commandments in the Christian tradition, but they are to tell the truth, we keep our promises, we respect individuals, which I think is like the Buddhist notion of do no harm, and the fourth is use fairness as a form of justice. Those are the ethical principles upon which I guide my life, and just raising awareness, I think, around the ethics is extremely important. Okay. What happens when a person chooses this second journey? And very simply, the way I put it metaphorically is a person begins to, you are profoundly transformed at the core, right? There are scientists, I'm just now reading a book on how enlightenment changes your brain. So there's a whole scientific aspect of this where Buddhists and scientists are actually studying the effects on the brain as we enter into this spiritual discipline. But more importantly, quite apart, and I'm not much of a scientist, to be honest with you, I care much more about how this begins to translate itself in terms of a change in a person's behavior, and a person's belief, and a person's motivations, right? And what St. Paul says is we see through a glass darkly, right? What's he saying? Well, he says, well, we can't fully understand the fullest expression of the energy that comes from pursuing a spiritual journey, but it has a profound transformative impact on our lives, not just at the cellular level, but it manifests itself, among other things, in a higher degree of freedom as we lose the bonds that have held us back with our toxic emotions, and creates for us a much greater capacity to be kind and generous to others. And this profoundly affects every aspect of our life, our family life, our business life. We had an experiment at RIM where we sent approximately 35 people away individually on a program, which is essentially to explore the spiritual journey. And I would watch these business leaders come back. And I know some of them are actually on the call today. and to witness the manner in which their lives had been profoundly transformed, even after only spending 2 or 3 days focusing on this aspect of their lives. So the truth is, your life does transform itself. And as I say, St. Paul says, we see through a glass darkly. But the point is, we have a different lens. And the lens has to do with less orientation and fixation on ourselves and a far greater capacity to see the other. And this, I think, is a beautiful aspect. And I think this is actually what we're here to figure out, right? Is this aspect of ourselves. So I say, we commit ourselves to this spiritual journey. We don't have to. I would say increasingly more and more people are curious to pursue this question and restlessness that lies within them. This is not for everybody. And this is to be taken seriously, as beautiful as it is. And it's not easy, right? Aeschylus, who's a Greek poet and playwright, would talk about those of us who choose to take this path must suffer. And he says, even in our sleep and against our will comes wisdom that falls drop by drop from the heart by the awful grace of God. Now, it's obviously a religious statement, but the truth is, this path of the spiritual journey causes us to enter into a path of losing ourselves, which is so much in contradiction with what we believe is in the first journey, which is not to lose, but to gain. The first journey is all about gain, right? So what problems can arise, right? And so I'll reflect on my own. In 1980, I can remember driving in the car. I'd just been promoted. I was, in my 20s, and I would use prayer beads when I was traveling. It's like the mala in Buddhist tradition. It's a rosary in the Christian tradition. And then the thought hit me that if indeed I was pursuing this spiritual journey, how is it that at the same time I'm actually quite successful in business for my age? Am I a hypocrite, right? Or am I conflicted? Am I asked to be making a choice? And it reoccurred in 1988 when I was a vice president at AT&T, and the experience was so deep from the spiritual aspect of my life that I felt that I needed to make a change to my vocation, that I felt that I was actually being called into the priesthood. And this was me seeing that what I needed to do was make a change, or that I needed to make a choice. And I don't think that that's actually the dynamic here, right? And so here's the way I see this issue of oscillation between the first journey and the second journey, between the created self and the part of you which requires you to survive and thrive in life and to build and to grow and to gain, and the spiritual life, which is the complete opposite, which is to lose yourself, lose identity, open yourself, quiet your mind, begin to let, if you will allow me, the energy of grace, which has its own capriciousness, to almost transform yourself from the inside out. How are these two things reconciled? And the first point I would like to make is it's messy, but you have to learn to live inside the paradox. It's a false dichotomy. That in as much as, just like I have shared with you, I wrestled with the problem of having to make a choice. I don't think there's a choice at all. If you study, for example, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, what he would say is that in order for you to make progress, in developing a greater capacity for loving kindness, for example. If you want to make progress in the spiritual journey, you do so by getting more serious about the first journey. That actually, to me, makes a great deal of sense. That, in other words, there's only so many of us that can run off to a convent or a monastery or a hermitage. Most of us are being asked to stay here in the marketplace and live transformed lives, right? So I don't really see this necessarily, and you have changed. I'm going to talk a bit about that. But I actually see this as a false dichotomy. With all due respect, there was a gentleman that wrote a book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, right? And what he's saying is, I had to make a choice between my day-to-day life and my spiritual life. And my view of this is you don't have to make a choice. You just have to learn to live inside the paradox. And there may be some people, which precious few, that will see the need for a vocational change. My view is it doesn't matter what you do. It matters how you do what you do. And a case in point, I was trying to think of what's one of the most difficult things that a person has to do in a business career. And one of them is to let somebody go, to fire somebody from an organization in which you're the supervisor. And I would say, even in the midst of what appears to be the most obvious point of conflict, in which there is heightened emotion and difference of opinion, a transformed person who has committed themselves with a pure intention can enter into that experience and to do it with grace, because you're doing it in a manner in which you see that for whatever reasons there just isn't a fit, or perhaps there's been some kind of ethics violation or what have you. You don't judge the other person, but you deal with it with a manner of grace. And so I'm just using that as a simple example. Again, not necessarily what we do with our lives, but how we do it. So stepping back, what am I trying to finish off with? An understanding that the pursuit of a spiritual life causes a person to be transformed. And we get ourselves all caught up in language to try to describe what this looks like. But the truth is that you are transformed. And what you begin to exhibit, there's a presence. And I get into dangerous language here because it's not like I'm trying to create expectation. And because part of the paradox of the spiritual journey is that it's actually not a journey at all, but just a waking up to what we already are. But what I'm trying to say is, going back to that article that I mentioned earlier about being somebody before you can be nobody. In your efforts to become a nobody, what happens is you are so transformed that you see beyond yourself. You have a greater capacity for seeing the needs of others and seeing their suffering. You know, the greatest evidence of a transformed individual is this clear evidence of the combination of a higher degree of selfless compassion and what I would call authentic humility, right? And so there is no, there's no tension here. Unless you have a vocational tension, which is an exercise of your own discernment. So we've created a construct where we've said first journey, second journey. Now at the end of these comments, what I want to say is, really at the end of the day, there really is only one self, right? And whether you're Buddhist or you're secular whether you're Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or whatever. We're all here to figure something out. And the journey of life is more than the first journey. And the extent to which we can commit ourselves and take ourselves seriously is you're doing yourself a favor in order to completely fulfill what it is that you're on earth to actually learn. And that is the cultivation of the second journey. And there is no end game, right? Because in essence, what we're doing is we're trying to embrace the infinite in this journey. But we press on, and maybe with that, I'll just pause here, Tenzin, and I suspect that there are probably other ways in which you and I can converse to be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Don. I guess to use this analogy of first and second journey, I think it's one of the interesting things to explore is perhaps that, are they supposed to be parallel journeys, or are they supposed to be in tandem? Because if it's in tandem in terms of its serial kind of thing, oftentimes the challenge is to recognize, well, when should first journey come to a pause and the second journey begin, if you're not thinking of it in parallel but as sequential.
Yeah, well, I don't really see them as sequential. I think part of the problem is that people almost suggest that you don't begin the second journey until, it's almost as though there's an age correlation to this whole thing. Again, I'm reminded of His Holiness saying that you really can't seriously pursue losing an identity until you've actually created one, right? So you get caught up in the kind of problems that I had back in my 20s. The truth is that I think there's a restlessness that people wake up to as they get into their teens and into their 20s. And if you're responding to this restlessness, that in effect it's that they're happening simultaneously, right? And I think it's not a sequential thing. I think many people wake up to this after they retire, or that something terrible happens in their life, and then in fact, as Richard Rohr kindly points out in his book, the Falling Upward, that it's quite often when difficulties occur that people wake up to the spiritual journey. But I certainly do not see them as sequential. I don't, and I think what I'm trying to suggest, and absolutely, because this whole thing was your idea. I want to hear from you. But I think that my main point today is that there's an integrative quality to the first and second journey, and I actually think a person who says that they're committed to the second journey does so only through committing themselves. Like you have taught me so much about toxic emotions and the things that prevent us from being fully human. So if we're going to examine that first journey in order to make progress on the second journey, I think I see the whole thing very much as an integrated whole, and having a certain tolerance for ambiguity, right?
This thing of somebody and nobody. I think I mentioned in the book. There are variations of the story as it often happens in these cases, where it is said that there used to be a practice among the Jewish contemplatives where they would sit in a synagogue an hour before the prayer in silence, followed by this thing where they would, the rabbis would say, "Oh, I'm a nobody, I'm a nobody, I'm a nobody," to experience this practice of self-emptying in some ways. And so one day the janitor of the synagogue is reciting, "I'm nobody, I'm nobody, I'm nobody." And so one of the rabbi looks at the other rabbi and says, "Look now, who thinks he's a nobody?" You see, this idea that we construct even our stories around what it means to be a nobody. Okay? And this is where I think I find Merton's classifications quite useful, in the sense that everybody pretends or desires or seeks that they want to be somebody, and then certain days they wake up and they want to be selfless. But I think this journey of false self to selflessness is a toxic one, because we sort of fabricate what it means to be selfless. And so this idea that one needs to get to this idea of a healthy self, a healthy ego, to understand how this healthy ego, this healthy self operates in this world, to then get a better sense of what it means to be selfless. And so this idea of oscillation is interesting, because it implies a struggle. It implies that we are dictated, or our lives, our wills are dictated by certain push and pull in the world. But just like a clockmaker is looking at pendulum swinging, and when the pendulum is not swinging at normal frequency, say, something is wrong with the mechanics. Meaning that, as you said, that it's only when we hit certain crisis moments in our lives, or when supposedly the society tells you that you're old enough to retire, or that you're successful enough to retire, that those are the times when the pendulum swings the other way. But it's very erratic, this kind of oscillation, as opposed to dictating this regular frequency of oscillation, where this first and second journey becomes part of one's daily reflection. Meaning, in some ways that, that we need to perhaps regularly engage in this process of deconstructing the created self, to recognize which aspects of this created self are actually useful, and which aspects of this created self are unhealthy and not so useful, and let go of it. You see, so almost like on a regular sort of cycle, to enter this stage of self-creation, deconstruction of the self, and then recreating the self, back and forth, in order to sort of get to the optimal understanding of the self, which could be no self, but to not to sort of force this journey in a manner where we create all these conceptual ideas of what a somebody looks like. Any sense, any thoughts on what would help an individual to fine-tune the mechanics of this oscillation, that rather than leaving it to the whims of external conditionality, such as a crisis happening in life, or somebody dying, or even the society telling us that it's time for you to retire, how do we refine it in such a manner that we dictate the oscillation in some ways?
Very good. All right. So I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking that one of the things that perhaps I ought to do is get out my Instagram application and find a way to take a picture of me being selfless, so I can show the rest of the world my great progress in being selfless, and gain from that. Right. But to answer your question, I think you already answered your own question, which is very kind of you. And that is, I say, a person takes themselves seriously enough that they will come to terms with what it is they can do in their own life to develop their own practice, right? And maybe because I have the opportunity to make comment here, people will explore mindfulness, for example, or if they're Christian, they'll explore centering prayer, which for the most part is just a Christian version of a secular tradition. My view on these undertakings are they're wonderful aspects of a individual practice. And I'm trying to be practical here, but they're insufficient in and of themselves. And so I think a person's spiritual practice, to your point, ought to be something which has some degree of regularity to it, and is more than just an effort to try to quiet the mind. I've already tried to explain why I think quieting the mind is basic, fundamental, table stakes to a spiritual practice. But I also believe that it is not enough and it's not sufficient. So I think there are other aspects to the spiritual journey. If a person really wants to be authentic, right? And you said to deconstruct the created self and try to understand what is unhealthy. What are some of the aspects of being the unhealthy aspects of the mind? Well, there are those that pull us down: low self-esteem, self-doubt, how we compare ourselves to others. If we really self-examine the extent to which many of the things that we do are really just products of the fears that we carry around with ourselves that limit ourselves. So those are the things that pull us down. Then there are the other things that sort of, like an illusion, sort of elevate us and cause us to think of ourselves to be greater than what we actually are, which are to do with pride and the manner in which perhaps in business we compare ourselves to others. All that's necessary for survival, which is fine. But what you're called to do is to see the illusion of all those things and to try to find a way through your practice to lose the tyranny of those things and the extent to which you're a victim of your own thoughts. And I think that that's very much a part of the spiritual journey. And then if, how does one go about doing that? I think that's a question back to you, of how a person begins to embark on that. Absolutely, that you have a meditation practice. But what are some of the other aspects to a person's practice? In the Benedictine rule, if a person becomes a Benedictine monk or a lay person of a Benedictine order, they make a vow of stability in the tradition. And secondly, the second vow is what they call conversion of manners, what that means, which I'm now echoing back to your point, is that every day I wake up, I commit myself to change. I commit myself to self-reflection. I commit myself to a discipline and a practice, right? And whatever that practice is, whether it's a devotional practice or a meditative practice or what have you. So again, I think you're bringing up a good point, Tenzin, but it's not something that happens only as a result of life experiences. A person needs to enter into a cadence in their life where they take themselves seriously and they're willing to undertake a practice. Now, we can talk about aspects of that practice. I think you're in a much better position with what you know and your experiences and what you bring as a teacher to help us understand that.
I think when you have a moment, you should write a book that is titled "The Monk Who Never Bought a Ferrari." Given our mutual appreciation for cars and mechanics, but to to show the illusion of things.
Yes. Right. Right. Right?
I think, Thomas Merton speaks of this notion of knowing and curbing one's appetite. You see, and this is one of the things that in the analogy of the first journey, that our appetites are so big and so endless because we define success by certain kinds of accumulations and achievements and so on, and to the point that there's no end to it in certain regard, and that in some ways the spiritual life, as a north star, as a reference point, allows us to perhaps better get a sense of what is enough, how much is enough, or in which direction should this appetite work. So this idea of curbing the appetite,
Yeah.
I think is something that we ought to sort of look deeply into it, which goes back to the question of what is the motivation or what is the driver in this thing.
Yeah, I actually remember, Debbie and I have struggled pretty much our whole lives, and then working at BlackBerry around 2004, 2005, everything changed. It was like we'd won the lottery. And I told the CEO of the company, Jim Bosley at the time, that I've decided that I'm going to change my fear from not having enough to now being afraid that it would be taken away from me. Right? And so I'm a bit of a victim here of the need to hold on to those things that now I use to define who I am, right? And I'm fearful of the loss of those. So I think your point about reaching a greater understanding and appreciation for not being so attached to the things that that we crave. And I find, if you study craving, which I spent a little bit of time as a result of our friendship with these ideas that you've expressed. Underneath the craving quite often really is a fear that if I don't have these things, then among other things, I can't be the me that I think I am. And then also secondly, well, maybe I'm, that I'm one step away from being homeless and back out on the street again, right? I remember in the spring of 1998, I was called into an office, and I was a group vice president of Bell Canada, and they simply said, it's not you, it's us, but you're no longer an employee of Bell Canada. And I remember walking down Bay Street here in Toronto, which is like the major business street in Toronto, and I pulled out my business card and I looked at it, and it said Donald H. Morrison, Group Vice President, Consumer and Small Business. I said, well, that's actually not my identity anymore. Who am I? Who am I? Right? And so we have these seminal moments in our lives. But, again, our conversation today is, there's nothing wrong with the pursuit of a business career or any other kind of vocation. But to your point, coming to some greater understanding of the things that grip us and keep this notion of craving and attachment and selfishness and never enough, and moving from not having enough to now being afraid of losing what it is that we've acquired. I think these things are unhealthy, and I do think that we must reflect on these things to the extent that we can find a way in our own hearts to release ourselves from the burden of these attachments.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Which is easier said than done. It's easier said than done.
I think it is as you suggested, that it requires a degree of seriousness and sincerity in its exploration. We have a few more minutes left. and while we continue the conversation, but if you have any questions, just feel free to put it in the chat. And if it hasn't already been brought up in the conversation, I'll try to raise it. I think that, coming back to this thing of oscillations, that I think again a degree of seriousness and sincerity in raising this question on a regular basis of who am I is a interesting sort of process that allows us to examine the false self, the created self, and the aspirational self, the self that we actually want to be, and what the drivers are in that. What do you feel like is the role of the relational self? Meaning, there's a self that is constantly interacting with others around you, and influenced by social norms and things of that nature. Like, you and I have had this conversation today that if one of the questions that you often pose, which is great, that what does success look like, in any context, and when you go to a marketing agency and say, you want to become a spiritual leader, what does success look like? And they say, as long as you have over 5 million followers on Instagram or some social media, that's what success looks like, and so on. So coming back to this idea of how is it that you navigate or manage social norms and its influences in a manner that is useful and not toxic. You spoke about the toxicity of this constant comparison with the other that hurts this aspect of self-esteem. But when we are comparing ourselves to individuals that we aspire to be in terms of aspirational self, say, meaning that if I compare myself as an aspirational self to spiritual masters, it doesn't give me a low self-esteem. It encourages me, boosts my sense of, oh, there is the Dalai Lama, there's the Mother Teresa. Those are the qualities to aspire to, as opposed to the toxic kind of comparison. So, what are some of the other things that you recognize in this sense of influence in marketplace?
Well, I mean, the first thing is because you're talking about desire for one thing. I remember actually, again, attending with you, it might have been when we were in New Delhi, a talk that His Holiness gave. And this is where I think sometimes language doesn't help us. People talk about the importance of losing attachment and desire and that sort of thing. And His Holiness saying there are actually some things that it's important to have desire for certain things, right? I mean, there's certain tests like do no harm to yourself, do no harm to others. I think it's part of the human condition to have an aspiration to be better than what I was yesterday, right? And I actually welcome the fact that a person has ambition. That's the part of being human. This is where I say now we're living in what appears to be a contradiction, because on the one hand, that's what we're called to do on this earth for the short time that we're here. It's like the parable of the talents. So am I going to bury my talents in the ground and I'm going to be some quietistic individual who's sitting in a corner and meditating? And like, what good am I doing to the rest of humanity, right? So I think there's a great value in the desire for personal growth and a desire to be the very best human being that you can be. And in order to do that, to be ambitious and do it inside a social system like a company or whatever. But just recognize that that's not the end game, right? I mean, the other aspect of this is is the loss, and to see the illusion of that to a certain extent. So I think, you talk about Thomas Merton, you're talking about the first 2 chapters of his book called New Seeds of Contemplation, where he contrasts the difference between the false self and the true self, right? And we can fall into a trap where we say the human aspect of life is to not be preferred to the true self and the spiritual side. I'm saying no, actually. You've got to be the full human being that you were put on this planet to be, and part of that will require you to be, ambitious and to seek to grow and to be the fullest thing you can be with whatever talents have been given to you, to fully express those. The point is, you have to see the illusion of all of that, right? And the evidence, because you asked me about the relational aspects of this, the evidence of someone who is pursuing an authentic spiritual journey is at some point that they see that this has nothing to do with their own self-aggrandizement and their own self, that there's 2 elements to it. It is an embracing of the other and seeing their needs and walking in their shoes and having the compassion and the selflessness and the empathy to understand whatever it is, whether you're in a business meeting or involved in a negotiation or anything, that you see through a lens in which you are seeking to listen to the other. And your posture is not one of seeing yourself as necessarily better. You may need to do that in order to compete and to be ambitious, but in truth, you have an authentic humility with which you enter into virtually every encounter. That's how you're transformed. It's the clearest evidence that I have of anybody that really has an authentic spiritual journey, where, what I mean is, as contrasted to the person who's going to have an Instagram photograph demonstrating their selflessness. Their selflessness is manifest in being more compassionate in all those aspects, meaning that you listen and you sublimate yourself. And that's the second piece, that you are authentically humble. These are the behavioral manifestations of the transformation that's occurred inside a person who's pursued the spiritual journey. And I think that's what Merton was trying to get at in his True Self, False Self. Mind you, he wrote the book originally in the 40s, and I think that he moved a bit beyond that in the latter part of his life.
There's one question that is there a moment on the spiritual path where you understand that you can no more pursue the business career or the business life because you kind of have outgrown it spiritually?
No, no, because what I've said is, I think, I said, it doesn't matter what you do with your career. It's how you behave, how you conduct yourself, right? So the environment that you are in, the environment that you're in is a process of your own discernment of your gifts, and you've decided to pursue a career, right? And for you to go and change that simply because you've been to the mountaintop and had a spiritual experience, I think has an element of hypocrisy to it, right? There are people who will go to the mountaintop and they'll be so changed that they will change their vocations, and they'll go off and they'll go to Africa, or they'll choose to do something for the environment. And then, I applaud that. And I think that what they're doing is they're waking up to the aspect that was part of them from the day they were born. And this just, life is not a straight line. It's an amplitudinal wave, right? So I don't think that this, again, has to do with, I leave my business life behind and now I go and pursue something. I think it's how am I transformed in the life I'm living? And if I'm in the life that is in harmony with my gifts and my history, then I'm just going to how I live my life transforms itself, right?
There's a there's an
Not my,
interesting text in the Buddhist canon called the Sutra of Vimal Kirti, and where Vimal Kirti is this lay businessman, but it is said his realizations or his insights are same as that of the Buddha, and he sort of juxtaposes this entire uh, tension in some ways of uh, you know uh, that do you actually have to become a monastic, or do you have to become a renunciant in terms of the strict order of leaving the convention of the material life to actually get enlightened. And Vimalkirti suggests that no, you can actually find the fulfillment, and it is, as you iterated, it's how you do things, not what you do, but how you do things. And I think that's a good reminder. And holding nothing against Instagram, but I think if that's your measurement of selflessness, then I think the sign would be that next time you take a selfie and the photo is blank, then you have truly achieved selflessness, and you should try it several times. you know, and I think that will be sort of the
well,
the the distinguisher uh, between a narcissistic selfie versus a selfless selfie.
well, can
But
I ask you? Can I ask you a question, please?
sure.
You could have stayed in the monastery, and here you are. And I would say that you're taking. I think you've taken the road less traveled. I think it is a far more challenging life what you have chosen to do. And I would like to ask you why you feel that you have joined us in the marketplace, um, and with all the things that you're doing, and helping others to see differently. So what are the motivations that have brought you, among other things, to Russia, to Japan, to South America, to Canada? Of all my friends and business colleagues that I don't know anybody who's traveled the world as much as you have pre-COVID. But what are the motivations that drive you? What is your sense as to why you've made the choices that you've made?
I think partly it's a function of steering away from uh, tendencies of self-absorption in spiritual life, um, where there are great examples of individuals who uh, think that they're of service and who think they're compassionate, and as you refer to it constantly, the tyranny of thoughts that can go both ways. One is that it creates a sense of restlessness, but other times it creates this kind of self-absorption. Echo chamber is not just a phenomena that you see in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. It happens in spiritual communities as well. And I think one of the things of being in the marketplace is you get the pulse of what is relevant, what are the struggles that individuals are going through, and how truly can the spiritual discipline contribute to alleviating suffering and contribute to the sense of giving meaning um, in the marketplace itself. And the second thing is oftentimes also that when you're waiting in a temple for somebody to show up, it's oftentimes that they show up at moments of crises. See? And so, even as a spiritual counselor, all you're doing is acting like a temporary therapist, trying to sort of soothe them or balm them from the suffering that they have, uh, uh, you know, uh, experienced in marketplace. And so, I say it slightly jokingly, but it's like, if we set up the mechanics that spiritual counseling is only about working with damaged goods, meaning that people get damaged in the marketplace or conventional life, and then they come to spiritual life, I think it's sometimes too late. It's sometimes too late for them to truly see their own potential and their own spiritual aspirations. And so the idea that, there's a need to reform the marketplace, there's a need to change the rules of entanglement and engagement in the marketplace, uh, such that we can create perhaps a more healthier society and lessen this perceived dichotomy between spiritual life and conventional life. And Buddha himself, historically, uh, was always in the marketplace. He did not just retire to the Himalayas like most of his colleagues, but he came back in the cities. He came back to talk to the merchants, to the rulers, to the leaders, and I think that there is something aspirational about the path when we talk about transformation.
Thank you.
I think that's the time that we have for this morning. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Don, for taking time uh, to share and to speak to us. And I hope we'll have other opportunities to continue this conversation, because I do believe as long as we are alive, and perhaps even when we are dead, the oscillations will continue, and we'll have to figure out, what rhythm we actually want to create in our life for these oscillations to be smooth. And so thank you again, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, very good. Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ken.
Thank you.